Great.
Hey everybody, Jay Widener here, reality check. One more time, we're reading from A Monument to the End of Time, my book from 22 years ago or so. All right, today is chapter 9, section 3, Atlantis in the Andes. And I told you that I don't agree with everything that's in this book anymore, but so let's go back. This is the images on the Cross of Henday, and this is the images from Elaya's book, Secret of the Incas, that he went with Pizarro, and this is the same images almost completely. Thousands of miles apart, hundreds of years apart. All right. It's hard. Hang on. It's hard to determine exactly when the old world discovered the new. Columbus's voyages marked a watershed only of publicity and royal exploitation. Given that he seemed to know exactly where he was going, and had fairly accurate sailing directions on how to get there, discovery is hardly the correct term. In fact, the farther back we go, the less of a distinction we find between the old world and the new. One of the prime mysteries of the Bronze Age, roughly 3000 BCE to around 800 BCE, is where did the enormous amounts of copper needed to plate whole buildings in bronze, such as we find in Minoan Crete, come from? The tin came from England and the coast of Cornwall, but there are no significant copper deposits in Europe or the Mediterranean basin. So where did all the copper come from? In the 500 years before Columbus, we find evidence of Vikings, Scottish, and Welsh princes and Irish monks all traveling to the New World. Indeed, the Vikings created a colony in North America. A 12th century pope even appointed a bishop to Vinland, and the remains of his church can still be seen today in Newport, Rhode Island, Stone Tower. The Viking sagas show that they penetrated into the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes. The sagas also refer to the inhabitants of what is now New England as being Irish, labeling the region white man's land. This is curious since New England has many Celtic and even megalithic type stone structures whose close analogs are found in Ireland and the west coast of Britain. Such structures are found in odd places up and down the East Coast and differ greatly from the clearly indigenous Hopewell and Adena cultures in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. In the Grave Creek burial mound in West Virginia, a clay tablet was found with the inscription in ancient Celtic Iberian, exchanging greetings from the queen of a Celtic culture to the east and a king of the local Hopewell nation. This has been dated to around 1000 BCE. One must assume that the copper trade was still viable at that point, since the Hopewell Federation contained many sources of easily accessible copper. A megalithic or Celtic presence in North America seems indisputable given the evidence of the structures and the inscriptions on the ground. But they were not the only visitors to the New World. The Egyptians may have traveled as far as Australia in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, where the cartouche of Radadef, the son of Khufu, the Great Pyramid fame, has been found carved in stone in the desert outback. By the time of Hatshepsut, a millennium later, regular trade voyages were underway to places that remain unknown to this day. One of these was the land of the Copper Mountain, as the inscription reads on the porch of her mortuary tomb on the west bank of Luxor. The fact that cocaine and nicotine residue has been found in New Kingdom mummies suggests that this trade was, in fact, with South America. Soon after Hatshepsut's reign, New Kingdom Egypt lost its overseas trade to the up-and-coming Sea Peoples, the Phoenicians and the Minoans. By the time the Queen of the Celtic East in America was conducting her negotiations with the Hopewell magnate, a Phoenician was sure to be in the middleman in the exchange. Their trading culture began to fade with the arrival of iron-equipped Aryans, such as the Doric Greeks, a century or so after the turn of the first millennium BCE. These, of course, are the Greeks of our history books, brash barbarians eager to acquire the knowledge of the ancient world. Which brings us to Plato and his story of Atlantis. In his dialogues, teaching stories told as if they were sessions with the philosopher Socrates, Plato introduces the idea of an ancient civilization that died out in a great catastrophe roughly 9,000 years before the golden age of ancient Greece. In most of these dialogues, it's hard to tell which are Socrates' ideas and which are Plato's, but the Atlantis story is solidly attributed. In the Critias, it is Plato's friend of the same name who relates his tale. He claims to have heard it from his grandfather, who heard it from the great Solon, one of Greece's 7 sages, who heard it from an Egyptian priest of Sais named Sanchus. Thus, the story has made a clear and undeniably prominent lineage. But where was it? Plato tells us that in those days, the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by what you call the Pillars of Hercules. This seems clear enough, but modern knowledge of seafloor spreading and continental drift suggests that no extra island of any size is possible in the mid-Atlantic. The sunken continent idea seems improbable, even though Plato insists that Atlantis disappeared in a single day and night of catastrophe. Modern consensus among archaeologists and scholars is that if there is any truth to Plato's tales, then it must be referring to the explosion of Thera, an island in the Aegean Sea around 1500 BCE. Along with ignoring Plato's precise location and dating, this theory has massive problems on its own terms. Dramatic as the destruction of Thera was, its loss hardly affected life in the Mediterranean. The Minoans did not fade out overnight. Their main cities were not abandoned or destroyed for another 100 years. The Phoenicians were untouched, and their expansion of trade routes increased in the centuries after Thera's explosion. There was a disaster, and its destruction was sudden, but it was hardly the fall of Atlantis. Other theorists have located Atlantis in places as fanciful as Ceylon and Heligoland in the Baltic Sea. Ignatius Donnelly, a 19th century American political figure, wrote 2 massive books on Atlantis and the various catastrophes of prehistory. Atlantis, the antediluvian world, while believing in a mid-Atlantic island and other outdated ideas, come closest to being the textbook on Atlantis. Donnelly's suggestions are very close to the truth, as when he speculates that the end of the last ice age coincides nicely with Plato's dates for the destruction of Atlantis. However, Donnelly and other Atlantic theorists are right to take Plato literally. In front of the Pillars of Hercules is clear and simple enough, but they are misled by their maps. If we look at a standard wall map of the world, we see only open ocean in front of the Pillars of Hercules. That's not necessarily true. There is certainly room in the mid-Atlantic for a very large island or continent, but if we look at polar projection map or a globe, we notice something right away. There already is a large island continent in front of the pillars. It's called South America. Plato then tells us, quote, in a single day of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared in the depths of the sea, unquote. Given the evidence of modern geology, it's hard to conceive of how an entire continent or even a very large island could become completely submerged beneath the ocean. Even extreme theories such as crustal displacement can't account for a complete disappearance. We would do better to interpret Plato's statements as being a description of a vast tidal wave that brought the depths of the sea to Atlantis than to insist on a literal sunken continent. With that in mind, we turn to South America with new interest. Did it fit in any significant way with Plato's description? Plato says that Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, suggesting an accessible coast larger than Libya and Asia Minor, suggesting an accessible coastline of over 1,000 miles. South America is the only candidate, including mythical and mid-Atlantic islands, that fits this criteria. He goes on to say that Atlantis was the way to other islands, and from those you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent, which surrounds the true ocean, unquote. However you read this, it is quite startling and reveals that whoever told Solon originally knew much more about the true geography of the planet than he should have. Let us merely note that this description clearly could apply to South America. Evidence has been found of ancient visits to the Andean coast from Japan and China. And there is evidence in South America of both advanced civilizations and catastrophic destruction. On the shores of Lake Titicaca, high in the Peruvian Andes, stands the mysterious ancient city of Tiahuanaco, built according to tradition by the Andean culture hero Viracocha. Viracocha first appears in Tiahuanaco after a great disaster has destroyed everything. This is from Father Molina in his chronicle relation to the fabulous rites of the Yuga, which is a book about the Inca. They quote, they say that in it, the catastrophe perished all races of men and created things insomuch that the waters rose above the highest mountain peaks in the world. No living thing survived except a man and a woman who remained in a box. And when the weather subsided, the wind carried them to Tiahuanaco, where the Creator began to raise up the people and the nations that are in that region, unquote. Even today, the ruins of Tiahuanaco are impressive. To the early Spanish visitors, after the conquest, they were truly awe-inspiring. Garcia Lasco de la Vega, who visited in the mid-16th century, described it in this way, quote, "We must now say something about the large and almost incredible buildings of Tiahuanaco. There is an artificial hill of great height, built on stone foundations so that the earth will not slide. There are gigantic figures carved in stone. They are much worn, which shows great antiquity. There are walls of stone, which are so enormous it's difficult to imagine what human force could have put them in place. And there are the remains of strange buildings, the most remarkable being stone portals hewn out of solid rock. These stand on bases up to 30 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 6 feet thick. How and with the use of what tools or implements massive works of such size could be achieved are questions which we are unable to answer," unquote. One of the stone portals De la Vega describes stands at the northwest corner of a vast enclosure known as the Place of Upright Stones. This portal, while an amazing work of art, is also a complex and accurate calendar in stone. The whole complex has been found to be an intricate astronomical observatory, perhaps designed to calculate alignments of solstices and equinoxes with the galactic core and edge. Whatever it was designed to do, its astronomical nature allows us to date its construction with precision. In the 1920s, Professor Arthur Poznansky, a German Bolivian scholar who had been investigating Tiahuanaco for almost 50 years, published his monumental 4-volume Tiahuanaco, The Cradle of American Man. By using the small differences in the Earth's tilt against the ecliptic and its effect on the sunrise azimuth from century to century, Poznansky calculated a date for the construction of Tiahuanaco. The Earth tilt changes slightly over time, with a length of 1.5 precessional cycles between maximum and minimum. As we saw above, Reich postulated that the tilt angle is caused by the Earth's spin on the midst of an orgone flow from the center of the galaxy. On the basis of this bobbing or rolling motion like a ship on the ocean, Reich predicted the reason for the narrow 3-degree hand of the tilt. LaViolette also speculates that the periodic eruptions from the galactic core would create the tilt and therefore its relationship to precessional motion, Fulcanelli's helicoidal track of the sun. Poznansky found that by establishing the solar alignments of key structures that are now looked out of true, he could determine the angle of the ecliptic tilt at the time when the structure was built. He found a tilt of 23 degrees, 8 minutes, and 48 seconds. Comparing this angle to the graph developed in 1911 by the International Conference of Ephemerids, we find a date of around 15,000 BCE. Naturally, most Orthodox archaeologists find this hard to take. But his work was checked by a high-powered group of specialists, and at the end of a 3-year study concluded that Poznansky's observations were correct. The sites at Tiahuanaco were indeed laid out to match a tilt angle derived date of circa 15,000 BCE. This did little to changing the prevailing archaeological paradigm. Even today's glossy picture books of the Andes tell us that Tiahuanaco was built by the pre-Inca civilization around 500 BCE. No one has an answer for why anyone would build an observatory with its instruments 14.5 millennium out of alignment. Tiahuanaco was originally built as a port on the shores of Lake Titicaca when the lake was at least 100 feet deeper and far wider. In that case, Tiahuanaco would have been an island. And we can see the changes in the lake level and shoreline for over 5,000 years of inhabitants, until sometime in the 11th millennium BCE, when a sudden natural disaster struck the city. The evidence of this disaster is still visible in the vast chunks of rocks littering the site, like so many discarded matchsticks. Poznansky argued that this catastrophe was caused by seismic movements, which resulted in an overflow of the waters of Lake Titicaca in a vast flood. He cites the evidence of the jumbles of human, animal, and fish bones covered by alluvial deposits, suggesting that the water descended on Lake Titicaca and Tiahuanaco in an onrushing, unrestrainable torrent. This certainly sounds like Plato's description of the destruction of Atlantis. Curious enough, it is also LaViolette's predictions of the effects of the double catastrophe of a galactic core explosion. And while the initial destruction was sudden, the disasters continued for almost 2 millennia before the people of Tiahuanaco gave up and departed. This also fits LaViolette's galactic core explosion scenario and prediction. Does this mean that Tiahuanaco is the lost city of Atlantis? Possibly, for there is one curious connection with Plato's tale that is hard to account for in any other way. Plato tells us that Atlantis contained a number of elephants, a fact that argues against Crete or Thera. Present-day South America, of course, has no elephants, but during the last ice age, it apparently did. Remains have been found of a species called Cuvicorius, which was an elephant-like prosopid, complete with trunk and tusks. We find these animals carved on the great stone portal of the Gateway of the Sun, suggesting that they were common in the Tiahuanaco area. These elephants, however, became extinct around 10,000 BCE. Suggestive as this is, Tiahuanaco, even as an island, fails to match Plato's description of the city of Atlantis. His account of the city may, in fact, be purely symbolic or allegorical. Dr. LaViolette points out that the description of Atlantis matches a subquantum kinetic model of the primordial atom. At the very least, this would suggest that the Atlanteans had an understanding of the continuous creation of ether physics. While we can't definitely say that the ancient cultures of South America are the last Atlanteans, we can say that the likelihood is strong. No other alternative matches Plato so closely. An advanced civilization in 15,000 BC, whatever its resemblance to Plato, must be considered a candidate for Atlantis. The cross of Hende's inscription encodes a place of refuge, a place where the survivors of the last catastrophe gathered. It clearly says Inca Caves, Cusco, Peru, directing us to the ancestors of the mysterious builders of Tiahuanaco, the Inca. Whether or not Atlantis can be found in the Andes, Fulcanelli and the cross are telling us that the place of refuge can be found there. During the final draft of this volume, long after the above section was written, cartographer J.M. Allen publishes Atlantis, the Andes solution, which not only supported our idea on Atlantis in the Andes, but disclosed the actual location of the city itself. It is not often while navigating such obscure waters that one finds independent confirmation of one's more sensational theories, but it's truly gratifying when it happens. Starting with the common sense deductions that we arrive at, Allen focuses on South America as the most logical choice for Atlantis. He notes that the Indian name before Columbus had been reported as Atlanta, a name Allen feels is related to the Quechua word for copper, antis, and the Nahuatl word for water, atl. Since Antis is the origin of the word Andes, then we might support that the phrase on Hatshepsut's mortuary temple is the Egyptian name for Atlantis. Allen turned to Plato and, taking his description of a rectangular plain crisscrossed by a grid of canals in the middle of the island, literally settled on the altiplano of southern Peru and northern Bolivia as the best match. He built a three-dimensional model of the region and discovered Plato's rectangular plain surrounded by mountains. This, Allen believed, was the key to the mystery. Plato described a plain in the center of the long side of the continent next to a body of water. The plain was very smooth and level, surrounded by mountains on all sides, high above ocean level, and with the form of quadrangle, rectangular for the most part, and elongated. This, in fact, is a close description of the altiplano, the largest level plain in the world, which also contains the two inland seas of Lake Titicaca and Lake Popo. With this in mind, Allen went looking for Plato's regular grid pattern. It was described as a 600-foot wide canal running around the perimeter of the plain with regular intersections and transverse canals forming a vast gridwork. Quote, it only remains then to discover on-site evidence of a channel 600 feet wide to say without any more doubt that we are indeed is the proof that the city and the civilization of Atlantis existed in these parts, unquote. Allen informs us satellite and aerial photos suggest that such canals do exist, and in the summer of 1995, Allen traveled to Bolivia in search of them. Quote, I found, unquote, he tells us, the remains of a channel of enormous dimensions. The base of the canal was around 120 feet wide, and the gentle sloping sides were each of some 230 feet, making it just under 600 feet from crest to crest of the parallel embankments, unquote. Atlantis, it seemed, had been located. Allen buttresses his argument with examples of mineral wealth and early mining that match Plato's description. Atlantean use of gold to plate their sacred precincts has echoes in the Inca temples discovered by the Spanish, and a natural alloy of gold and copper mentioned by Plato can be found as a mineral only in the region of the Altiplano. As the matches mount up, we are convinced that Allen has discovered the source of Plato's tale. For much interpreters and Atlantis seekers, the description of the city itself is the most problematic. While concentric circles of water and land, why concentric circles of water and land? It seems odd and unnecessary, but the altiplano hypothesis addresses this very issue. Being an ancient volcanic region, there are many eroded volcanic cones around the altiplano, including those on the northeast side of Lake Popo, which match in size Plato's dimensions. These come from natural concentric circles out from the central flow of the volcano and can be easily shaped and filled with water to produce a specific Atlantis configuration, which Allen calls the Cross of Atlantis. It is possible that this ancient civilization built its greatest city as a model of the primordial atom of continuous creation and the great cross of the galactic alignment. Allen's work does have a few flaws. He seems hesitant to let go of the Sea Peoples and the Bronze Age date of Thera, even though he tells us that Lake Popo flooded the region around 12,000 BCE. It's hard to account for this reluctance to go with the older dates. He is apparently unaware of Professor Poznański's work and barely mentions archaeoastronomy in any meaningful way. Even with these gaps, it is clear that Allen is presenting significant evidence for the location and the date of Atlantis. Here we have proof that Fulcanelli's place of refuge was the ancient home of the advanced global civilization of prehistory. The Atlantean culture survived 1,000 years or more of intermittent catastrophe before finally emigrating to their colonies around the planet. Viracocha of the Inca was the godlike survivor from the Atlantean civilization who brought back to cataclysm and ravaged regions the skills and graces of civilization, including perhaps the knowledge of how to calculate the time of the next cosmic disaster. And that's the end of that chapter. Now, I believe that Atlantis was probably the Azores and the islands surrounding them. But I think Atlantis was a global civilization also, and that it could have been everywhere. It would seem like America is a global civilization. So you'll find traces 1,000 years from now of America being everywhere. And I think Atlantis was the same thing. Do I think Atlantis was in South America? I think it's a possibility. I think Atlantis could have been everywhere. Could have been in North America. It could have been in Africa. The Richat structure could be part of Atlantis. So I think we have to expand our view of what Atlantis was. The best argument, besides the altiplano, is the word Atlantis. Atl means water, and Antis is how you pronounce the Andes Mountains by the Native Americans. We Europeans changed it to Andes, but it was Antis, which means copper. So Atlantis is a South American word. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Hit like and subscribe, and I will be back with another chapter. Thanks for watching. I really do appreciate it.